Foley Institute, and on behalf of the Foley Institute, on behalf of the MLK committee here at WSU, I want to welcome you out to our event today. We're extremely honored to have with us today Shaun King. Shaun is currently a writer in residence at Harvard Law School's Fair Justice Project and a columnist at The Intercept. As a senior justice writer at the New York Daily News, Shaun wrote over 630 columns. He's also a regular political commentator for the Young Turks and on the Tom Joyner Morning Show, and was formerly the justice writer for the Daily Post. Shaun has written extensively about the Black Lives Matter movement, covering discrimination, police brutality, the prison industrial complex, and social justice in the wake of violence in places like Baltimore, Ferguson, and Charleston. A strong advocate for families, Shaun is a major fundraiser for victims of injustice and was the founder of both Twit Change, which won the Mashable Award for the most creative social good campaign, and Hope Mob, whose social media footprint is now amongst the top 10 for social charities. Shaun is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Epic Humanitarian Award and the Hometown Hero Award from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. It's our honor to have with us Shaun King. He's going to speak for about 20 or 30 minutes and open up for questions and answers, and we'll go for about an hour today. So join me now in welcoming Shaun King.
Good to see you. Thanks for being here. Sorry some of you are stuck on the back wall back there, but I'm glad you made it. Pullman is hard to get to. I know I've been some far out places, but it was tricky to get here, and it definitely showed me, particularly for those of you who aren't from the area, if you're coming here from far away, you might feel a little isolated. So I understand that and sympathize with how that might feel. I'm honored to be here. I mean that. This is one of my favorite opportunities, is to get to see students and staff face to face. I'm looking forward to tonight. I hope you come back. What I'll be speaking about is totally different than what we're doing here. But I always ask for these types of opportunities because it gives us a chance to engage each other. Feel free to push back if you have any questions about what I'm saying. I'm perfectly fine with that. This is the place for that. Social media is a horrible place to disagree, and in great part because you lose tone. You lose. Someone may have meant one thing, but because you think you know the person, you may have kind of imposed on them a way that's very different than what they really felt or meant. And I'm a pretty down-to-earth guy. I don't know how much you know about me, but when I was at an event at my daughter's school recently. I have 5 kids, but I have 2 teenage daughters, and I heard some kids at their high school. They saw me and they knew me from the internet, and they said, "There's at Shaun King." Like, not Mr. Shaun King, but they put, young people see me and they literally put an at sign before my name. And I don't see myself as at Shaun King. I don't. Social media is a tool to communicate. It's a medium of communication, and there's some things that really work with it, that work well, but it also causes some real problems. And I think when we look back on this generation, social media will be a huge part of our story. More so in how we probably misunderstood each other than how we came to understand each other. And so when I wake up in the morning and go about my day, I don't think of myself as a celebrity or as a public figure. I'm 38, but I've been with my wife since we were 15 years old. I have kids from preschool, elementary school, middle school, high school, 4 girls and a boy. And so much of what I do, and I don't tweet it or Facebook it, so much of what I do with them in mind, thinking about the world that I hope they will live in and inherit. And so I see myself way before I see at Shaun King. I see myself as a father, a husband. I see myself as a journalist, as an organizer. And I want to talk for just a few minutes about something that's been done here over the past 2 years that I think in great part because of social media has been widely misunderstood. And I came to know Colin Kaepernick first about 3 years ago. Now, I actually was a fan before I knew him personally. I was rooting for him when they made it to the Super Bowl. I knew a little bit about his story. I, just like most public figures, I really only knew him as an athlete. I knew very little about his history. I knew he had been adopted at a young age. I knew he was born in Milwaukee but moved to California. I knew he was a product of interracial marriage, was adopted by a white family and kind of moved to a remote place in Central California. And so I only knew like the little stories that they told before the game. You know, I'd watch him play for the 49ers. And every now and then they do like a little biographical piece on the quarterbacks and stuff. But toward the beginning of what we think of as the beginning of this Black Lives Matter movement, he followed me on Twitter. And he right away sent me a message just asking me really some inquisitive questions about some issues of injustice. And right away, even just from the words that we typed back and forth, he defied the stereotype of what people think of as athletes. I knew right away that I was talking with a guy that was brilliantly smart. He was valedictorian at his high school, which doesn't happen on accident. He had gotten scholarship offers. I never heard this, but he'd gotten scholarship offers to Ivy League colleges and universities all over the country. But he was so determined on playing Division I football that he ended up going to a smaller school academically because he wanted to play college football for a competitive team. But could have gone anywhere and done anything. And I've come to know at least 100 guys in the NFL, and he's one of the guys that didn't need football. Like he could have chosen 20 different career paths, and just a really sharp dude. And as we would banter back and forth, he mainly just kind of treated me like Google. Like he would just send me a message and just ask me to explain something to him, or he would have a question. Because what he and I noticed at the same time, what a lot of people notice, is that a lot of the articles that we would read about injustice in America seemed to have a complete side missing to them. They were rarely told from the perspective of victims, of families who experienced the injustice. And his question to me was sometimes just, what more can you tell me about this? What's going on behind the scenes with this? And it was almost 2 years later and we had been talking all that summer, in the summer of 2016. He had actually been injured, and it was for the first time in his life that he wasn't a starting quarterback somewhere. He had been a starting quarterback in elementary school, middle school, high school, college, several years into the pros. He had made the Pro Bowl, gone to the Super Bowl. And what happens when these guys get injured, football is extremely brutal physically. I kid you not, like I've spent time with a lot of these guys after the game. It's like a fist fight every week. Like even whoever your favorite players are, even the kickers and other guys, when you see them after the game, they're like battered and bruised and limping along, and it's just an incredibly physical sport. And when you're playing it, it's hard for those guys to think about much else besides the game. And so he had this weird moment in his life where he was injured and he wasn't playing, and it gave him a real opportunity to be able to reflect about the world. And over the past few months, when we started talking, some horrible things have happened across the country. There had been the arrest and death of a young lady named Sandra Bland, and that seemed to shake him up in particular. A video had been released of her arrest, and I don't know how much you know about Sandra, but she had actually just taken a job at Prairie View A&M, a small school in rural Texas, and she went to college there, but she moved back she lived in Chicago, was from Chicago, and moved back to take this job, and she was literally pulling off of the campus. I saw where I spoke there at Prairie View, and we drove up here in Pullman to the campus, just like the street where there's a new building in the very front of the campus. You know what I'm talking about? Where she was pulled over was the equivalent of like on that street. She was not technically on the campus, but kind of was. And an officer pulled her over, and she ended up being arrested. She was injured during the arrest, and then she died in jail 3 days later. And that summer there were several horrible incidents of police brutality that had been filmed. A guy named Terrence Crutcher had been killed outside of out of his car. There's a guy named Alton Sterling in Louisiana, and there were these moments of horrible violence that were filmed, and it just seemed to really shake him up. And maybe you can relate to some story of it doesn't have to be police brutality, but maybe there has been something awful that's happened in this country or around the world. Like, something awful happens every day, right? But every day when something awful happens, it doesn't hit you the same. And maybe there's been something awful that you've seen or experienced that just connected with you more than others. And for Colin, this succession of these incidents, it just really shook him up personally. And he did not tell anybody this. And he and I were talking a lot that whole summer. And the NFL preseason started. And he, for the first 2 or 3 preseason games, and it never made the news, for the first 2 or 3 preseason games, when they would play the national anthem, he just sat on the bench. And come the 3rd preseason game, somebody had noticed the prior game that they thought he was sitting. You have to go back in time a little bit. All of these incidents of police brutality, they were huge stories at the time. And a local reporter there in San Francisco just wondered, like, because he had been injured, just wondered, like, is he sitting because he's injured? Okay, this is the 2nd week in a row. He was sitting the 3rd week in a row, and the reporter after the game just asked him, like, hey, I think I noticed you sitting during the national anthem. And even he had not, he's in a relationship with a long-term relationship with a woman. He hadn't talked with really her about it. He hadn't talked with me about it. He didn't talk with us. He's close with his parents. It wasn't something that he's like, guys, here's what I'm going to do. Like, there wasn't this deep strategy. It was very practical. He was at these games, and he was just disgusted with what was going on in the country, and kind of hurt and even just confused. And I think there was something else going on. I think there was a part of him that felt like, damn, I make so much money, and I'm so famous, and it looks like I can really do nothing about any of this. I can tweet about it. I can, sometimes guys will call the families and send them their love and that type of thing. But a lot of guys were, in Colin and other guys were telling us, like, man, I just feel so powerless. And when a young guy right around the 4th of July named Philando Castile was shot and killed by police in his car, I think that was a pivotal moment for Colin, where he just felt like, I'm disgusted with our country. And so when they played that national anthem, less than it was like, hey, I'm a protest, it was more like, I just don't feel like standing up for this. I just don't. I don't know how many of you are religious, but have you ever had times where you're just like, I don't feel like praying? Like, you weren't saying, God, I'm protesting. Right? Like, hey, everybody, I'm going to have a protest. I'm protesting God, and my protest is I'm not praying. But you probably have moments in your life where it's just like, I'm not going to church. I'm not doing this. Or maybe they played in your life the national anthem, and you're just like, oh, this is background noise. But he heard those words, and he just felt like, what a lie. That's what he was thinking. It's just like, wow, it's not the land of the free, the home of the brave. This song is not true, and I don't believe it. These are the things he's thinking on the sidelines of the game. And that after the third time, when the reporter asked him, the world came to know very quickly, he's a brilliantly smart guy. And the reporter asked him, hey, are you not standing on purpose? What is that? And he said, yeah, I'm so bothered by police brutality in America that I feel like this country doesn't live up to its songs, its creeds, its mottos, and I'm trying to show solidarity with these families. And at that time, it was still preseason, but it got a lot of coverage. And his thought even then wasn't, I'm going to start a movement. And he wasn't even trying to start a movement. He wasn't strategizing or planning it. He really was just a very reflective man who just felt like, I feel weird standing up for this. And it ended up becoming something much deeper than that, where the whole country was watching. And you may have seen, and maybe you know, the story of Nate Boyer, who played in the NFL for years, but also served in the military. And Nate reached out to Colin and said, listen, I think if you're going to continue this, there's a way that you can do it that would be more respectful than just sitting on the bench during the anthem. Why don't you consider taking a knee? And Nate told him, like all the times in the military where they take a knee as a sign of respect. And Nate even talked to him about, even during prayer and during religious ceremonies, where people take a knee. And Colin's thought was, I am definitely going to continue this because I want to show people that our country could be better. And so he decided to take a knee. And what he or none of us really understood was that back to social media, because of the way social media works, and not just social media, but because of the way people tell the news now, a lot of people told this story of an arrogant, aloof athlete who hates soldiers and who has no idea how disrespectful he's being, who he's offending. And those of us who knew him were just like, wow, it's so peculiar to hear people talk about you in a way that's not at all reflective of your heart. And I'm going to linger in this one point for a little bit, and I look forward to taking some questions. And he had taken those deaths, particularly of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling and Terrence Crutcher and Sandra Bland. He had taken those deaths very personally. And I want to say something to you. Maybe this never occurred to you, but different people process pain in wildly different ways. And when you get a chance, there's something so fascinating I would encourage you to Google. And it's like a black hole of information there's so many studies about it. Google the word mirror neurons and put in there Rodney King. Okay, maybe you're familiar with Rodney King. He was a black man in Los Angeles who was beaten by the LAPD. This was before cell phones, but it was really the first viral video. It went viral on the news, not on social media. This is 1992. And they did these studies where many of us in the room who are 30 and over have probably seen that video. We probably lost count of how often it was played when it actually happened. Dozens and dozens of times. It was played every day for months on end. There were riots in Los Angeles, and many of us think we've seen riots, but this was something totally different. 100 people were killed, which we haven't seen anything like that in these past. This is something altogether different. There were fires in Los Angeles for almost 60 miles up and down the coast, and it was just a horrible, painful moment. And some scholars did this study showing different ethnic groups the video, and they studied their brain's reaction, and then they did a complex questionnaire afterwards. And what they found was, by and large, and there were some exceptions, you can read this, the study is comprehensive, you can read it for yourself. By and large, the more white people watch the video, the less they care. And sometimes they found that even the first 2 or 3 times they would show the video to white participants, voluntary participants in the study, there was just not a deep emotional response. And what they found versus African American participants in the study was that no matter how many times they studied it, the neurons were firing off very, very differently. And here's what they found. When African Americans will watch this video of Rodney King, mirror neurons is when you see something and you see it happening to you. And so when African Americans will watch this video, they would internalize the pain and the violence, and it felt personal every single time. Whereas by and large, and it wasn't about empathy, okay? The study was deep. The study got to the fact that because a lot of people, when they saw the video, saw something that they knew would probably never happen to them, would never happen to their mother, father, brother, sister, cousin, next door neighbor. To them, it was a news story. And I want you to consider, and we should all consider this, that when Colin and others saw what happened to Sandra Bland, saw what happened to Alton Sterling or Philando Castile or Freddie Gray, or you Tamir Rice, you put a name in there. They saw something that they felt like could happen to them, could happen to their family, and they internalized the pain in a way that we don't give a lot of room for. We're not giving room for other people's pain. And so, for him, this was not a hashtag. It was not a news story. This was a guy whose heart was hurting, and just felt like, and very literally felt like, I have no idea how I can make a difference with this. And in the spur of the moment, decided first to just sit down and then later take a knee. And it became a movement in a way. It also became an issue that people used as a political football. President Trump mocked Colin many times in speeches around the country because what Colin did was so mischaracterized by people who did not understand his motives. They just didn't know him. He's a very quiet, even shy guy. Like he's reserved. He's a thinker. He's a feeler, and he was just a guy who wanted to make a difference. And to this very day, it's split down two demographics. If you ask people what they think about what he did, it's split. First, it's split down age. Interestingly enough, the biggest gap is the younger someone is, the more they identify with what he did. The older someone is, the less they understand it, and that's versus all cultures. But race certainly played a factor. It's not because your skin is white, you see what he did differently. What it really got to is, if you're a white in America, where you get your news may be wildly different than if you're black in America. Where what people are saying on your timeline is wildly different. And what it really got, the root of it, and it's tragic in a sense, is that in spite of all of this social media, our bubbles are thicker and thicker and thicker. And what people say in that bubble has a huge impact on how people feel. Like, and I'll close with this thought. I live in New York City. I live in Brooklyn. And after Donald Trump was elected, the next day, I swear, I don't know if you watched The Walking Dead, but New York looked like The Walking Dead. Like, I know, like, we're, you know, maybe this university may not necessarily be Trump country, but this is a conservative part of the country. What New Yorkers, what they really had to come to grips with is that nobody they knew voted for him. Mm-hmm. Nobody on their Facebook timeline voted for him. Nobody on their Twitter timeline voted for him. Like, no one in their universe voted for him. And so the notion that he could win, he won 30 states. The notion that we can talk about Russia, electoral college, he won 30 states. Mm-hmm. But within those 30 states, what we found is that people's bubbles are so heavy and so isolated that the next day a lot of people were like, how could this happen? But that was more a reflection of, on their Facebook friends hated him almost universally, so there was no way he could win according to their Facebook friends. And it's like, hey, the world is bigger than your Facebook page. Right? A lot bigger. The world is bigger than where we get our news. The world is bigger than Fox News. It's bigger than MSNBC. It's big, you know, and I want to encourage you to try the best you can to break outside of your bubble. Not that it will change the way you feel, but it will at least give you an opportunity to be like, wow, some people really see this very differently. You can still think they're wrong, you can still disagree with them, but you at least need to understand it. And I hope with questions today, if there's any way that I can give you any understanding, I'd love to help. We have about 30 minutes.
Yeah, about 30 minutes. So I want to encourage people to keep your questions very short and not to make statements, so we get as many as possible. And maybe I'll just start us off. You know, I appreciate the conversation about Colin Kaepernick and his motives. But as you say, this has become a much bigger movement and problem now because of Trump's intervention in it. So where do you think the protest should go now? And where do you think it will go? Where should it go and where do you think it will go?
Yeah, that's a great question, man. You know, protests at first are just a way for people to express their pain, their frustration, when they don't see any other solution to it. People protest because they feel like the traditional channels of justice aren't working for them, so they have to use some other method. Here on campus, I learned that there were protests and sit-ins even here on campus And from the outside, some people would see that and they wouldn't understand it. And the primary people who don't understand protest tend to be people who the justice system works for them. It's like, why would someone do that? Well, if by and large systems of power traditionally work in your favor, protests would seem really peculiar. But protests change. I'll talk a little bit about this tonight. Change is hard and slow. And if change has 10 steps to it, protests are like step 1. And what a lot of us have come to understand is if there are substantive changes we want to make, protest makes the issue known. Protests cause awareness, but protests alone rarely make change happen. And so many of us are moving, protests should always continue, but many of us are moving from saying, how do we change policies? Sometimes we change policies by changing the people who make the policies. Sometimes we change policies by joining. This is an oversimplified way, and then I'll close and take questions from everyone. It's an oversimplified way to see the world, but I've come to understand that there's an inside way to make change happen, and there's an outside way to making change happen. And a lot of times, insiders and outsiders are deeply skeptical of one another. And if you push them, and I've done my own research on this, insiders tend to think they're doing it the right way, and outsiders think they're doing it the right way. And what I've come to understand is that you have to find a way for the insiders and outsiders to work together, or they'll just be speaking at each other, not with each other. They won't learn from each other. And you need people on the inside to make change happen. For instance, in the United States, several states now are already, people use the phrase majority minority. I think that's a ridiculous phrase. But what they mean is several states are now primarily people of color, and yet 95% of prosecutors in America are white. 95%. It's not even remotely similar to the country's demographics. Even in states that are incredibly diverse, district attorneys aren't. And there are many complex reasons why that is, but many of us have come to understand, hey, if we want to change that system, it may not be me, it won't be me, but someone needs to be inside of the system. And a lot of us are going that direction. I have a buddy of mine, for instance, a close friend of mine who's running for city council. I think you'll see a lot of people who have been protesters over the past few years say, hey, I'm going to try to go inside the system and change it from the inside. I think you'll see more and more of that over the next few years. Hey, I'll come around. Yeah, what's your name, man?
Cliff.
Hey, Cliff.
Talk a little bit about what Colin Kaepernick's been doing outside of the NFL since his blackballing.
Yeah, I'm really. I'll say this tonight. It's hard to know a moment in history when you're in it. For instance, what we now know as the Civil Rights Movement, which took place from like 1954 to 1968, for the first 5 or 6 years, that phrase, Civil Rights Movement, they weren't even using that phrase. That phrase came much later, and it really wasn't even until the mid-'60s that it was widely used. And it mainly started being used in history books in the 70s and 80s. But when they were right in it, those were just people fighting for their humanity, for their dignity. What has happened to Colin is a gross injustice. He lives in New York now, and I see him regularly, and he's the healthiest, strongest, most prepared guy he could ever be. Over the arc of his career, last year, the last season he played was his worst season ever. And statistically, he ranked about the 15th to 7th, depending on what stats or metrics you use. He ranked somewhere between the 15th and 17th best quarterback in the league in his worst season. And there are 90 positions, 90 quarterback positions, and he didn't get one. They literally brought guys out of retirement who said that they didn't even want to play anymore. They brought guys who weren't even starters in college. When Colin played, he started all 4 years in college. He still, to this day, has several college football records that stand. And so I think he thought he was going to get a job. And a lot of people felt like, I know he thought that. And we talked about it, and he literally was working out 6 days a week. And he was prepared. He studied game film. He studied playbooks. He wanted as best as he could, if a team needed him, that he could go out right away. And his thought was, there are going to be teams that are used to making the playoffs that are going to have somebody hurt, and they'll sign me because their teams and their cities would not want them to throw the season away. And what he found is that was not the case. Teams that always make the playoffs, like the Packers, that's a great example. All over the league just said, nah. And he didn't even get one single tryout. There were some lies that people, it's so ridiculous. Several people said he was demanding a lot of money. He openly, I know Colin well, he openly said he would play for the league minimum. He openly said he would even take a backup role, even if it just meant him mentoring another quarterback. He never got one tryout. And so he decided to use his time to stay fit and ready. But for the first time in his adult life, he had all of this time where he wasn't with the team. And so he traveled all over the country, meeting charities, meeting leaders, doing really great work. He pledged to give $1 million to charities, and he would give $100,000 a month. He just gave away the final $100,000. I think privately when he made that announcement, he did think he was going to be playing for another team. And if he reneged on that and said, listen, I don't think anybody he would have gotten widely criticized for it, but people would have understood. Right. So here he is, a man without any income, giving away $1 million. He's just a humble, quiet, good guy, and he stayed really encouraged. All of us around him, particularly his mother and his family and others, have been very hurt for him, but he seemed to take it well. I don't know if beyond all of that there's a level of pain that he never shared. I think that's probably the case. All of us, you're walking on campus and somebody asks you how you're doing. Even if you're doing really horribly, you normally say, I'm okay, even when you're not. And so we'll see. I think he'll continue to try again. He's still in game shape and ready to go, but we'll see. I think he's a tremendous leader, and he's got a lot of potential no matter what he does. Hey, what's your name?
Brooke.
Hey, Brooke.
Hi. Hi. So I was just kind of thinking about, I'm from North Idaho where it's pretty conservative, so a lot of people make the argument that white people, somebody told me this, white people are under attack, and that white people are being, I guess other people are being racist towards white people, and that when we call out racism, we're referred to as bigots. How would you respond to that?
Well, I will go back and say there is something to say again about when in your bubble like the reality you live becomes real for you. And so when that conversation is a very real conversation, and that's the only conversation in your circle of friends, it becomes a degree of a self-fulfilling prophecy where you believe it. And what I tend to, there's very little I could say or do to someone who feels that way. I'm not the person for that. But for someone who may be connected to someone who feels that way, sometimes you have to have a conversation and say, hey, can you break that down for me? Like, what are the, because sometimes we have to understand that facts and feelings are not the same thing. Like, you may feel oppressed, but maybe the facts don't bear that out.
So how do you challenge them when they do say they're oppressed, like white people say they're oppressed? How do you kind of disprove that?
Let me give you a few things. Right now, this is real time, okay? Right now, Donald Trump is saying that Democrats are going to shut down the government. But it's an impossibility. It can't happen. It can't happen. Republicans control, and with very few exceptions, at this time in America, Republican is basically code for white. Okay, Republicans control the House, the Senate, the presidency. They control the majority of state legislatures and the majority of governorships in America. White people have never had more power in modern history than they have right now. No, I mean, it's just true. There are fewer white people in jail or prison than we've had in 20 years. I have an article coming out tomorrow about the criminal justice system that unpacks that. White men still make more money than in any other demographic group in America. It's not even close. Black women, for instance, make 60 cents on the dollar compared to white men. But still, white men think they make the least amount of money. They make the most. And again, it gets to, if your news sources tell you that you're oppressed, and not just your news sources, when the President of the United States says Democrats are going to shut down government, you should be able to accept that that is exactly what's going to happen. Now they're using a line to say that when Democrats shut down the government, which they can't do, you can only shut something down when you have the majority. They're saying that they're going to close off funding to the military. But in a government shutdown, funding for the military continues. He tweeted it multiple times today. But let me tell you why. Because if that was true, that'd be awful. But like, what? If the military really mattered to you, and the President of the United States tells you that this group of people is going to shut down the government and the military, that's frightening. Except it's all a lie. But when it's coming from someone that you should be able to trust, it feels like the truth. And so we're in this age where people have to somehow figure out the difference between facts and feelings. And it's not easy. It's not easy at all. And I think our nation is deeply, deeply divided on many different fronts, and my gut tells me that a lot of that division is so deep it'll be here for a long time. So hold on. Hey, man.
Hi, my name is Devin. I have a question piggybacking off of that.
Sure.
We saw on the campaign trail this year and last year how Donald Trump personally attacked Colin Kaepernick, several times that
it was effective.
Yeah,
you know?
and how do you think that has affected the whole movement through the NFL as a whole? I know a lot of players like Michael Bennett and other former NFL players have complained how the message has been lost. How do you think that rhetoric coming from the highest level has affected the whole protest?
Yeah, I say two thoughts about it. I don't know if those of you who may disagree with me politically, I hope you still will actually read not just my tweets, but I write normally an article a day, and I love for you to read what I write in long form. I have said for years before he was elected that Donald Trump is way more effective at what he does. Like even as a political opponent, I had a new piece that came out earlier this week. I find him to be a very formidable, difficult, nebulous person to come against. And in part because he has such a huge social media platform, and because the news media follows and tracks every single word he says, when he says something, it has a huge ripple effect. So there were two things that happened when Donald Trump began attacking Colin by name. Again, I gave you an example where he said Democrats are going to shut down the government. It's not true. Where he said when the Democrats shut it down, they're going to take the funding away from the military. It's an impossibility. There are rules that put a barrier up around that funding. Well, the same thing happened. He began saying that he called Colin and others, he called him a son of a bitch, which had never been said by a president. Now, presidents often call people names in the Oval Office, but this was at a rally carried on live television. And it had two effects on players. Some players, I know because I spoke with them, some got really spooked by it because they felt like this is dangerous for us. That when the President of the United States says these guys are sons of bitches who hate the military, I know at least 20 guys who have been protesting either by raising a fist or taking a knee, whose brothers, sisters, fathers, and mothers are in the military. This had nothing to do with the military for them. They felt like, well, this is going to cause us to be in danger. And then another group in the NFL felt violated in a sense, and they felt like, okay, we have to step up as well. So for those next few weeks, instead of it just being like a handful of players, you had hundreds of players who were making demonstrations in some kind of way. But so that's the first thing. The second thing is Donald Trump is a master at being at the center of any conversation. Like and I don't even mean this as a. I think he has. He just had his physical, but he wasn't seen by a psychiatrist. He was seen. I actually, if you see my timeline, I defended the doctor Rodney Jackson a lot. He's actually an amazing doctor. He was Barack Obama's doctor, and people who attack him are just ridiculous. They don't understand. He's actually a really reputable guy, and I'm not convinced that Donald Trump weighs 239 pounds either. But if Rodney Jackson says so, like maybe he does. Maybe like fat and muscle don't look the same. Right? Like no, I'm saying it's a 239 pounds of muscle. Looks very different than I don't know if you saw people from his team said he routinely eats from McDonald's and he'll eat 2 fish sandwiches, 2 Big Macs, fries, and a chocolate shake. It came out in he does have kind of entry level of heart disease. It's kind of common, but I said to say that I think he has a clinical need to be at the center of attention. And most polls show that even a lot of conservatives and Republicans accept that. There's something in him that has to be at the center of conversations that have almost nothing to do with him. So when this conversation about the NFL protest got huge, I think he just saw an opportunity to put himself right in the middle of it. And it really took the conversation away from being about police brutality. A lot of the families that hoped their stories would be told of the brutality they experienced, they were wounded by it as well. It just felt like they didn't believe he cared about them anyway. But when they saw how he treated the issue, they just felt like he definitely doesn't care. And many of these families had open cases with the federal government that they were still hoping that they would get some type of justice for. But he's a complicated guy. Like, when his test came back that he passed this cognitive test, it was not. He now has started talking about the cognitive test like it was an IQ test. But if you've seen this mantra, there are copies of it.
Yeah.
It literally, on one question, it has a picture of 5 animals, and you just have to give the names of the animals. Like it's not an IQ test. So its purpose is to test dementia, which is very serious, and he's 70 years old, and that's a possibility. But I was actually when it came back that no, he doesn't have dementia, my response to that was, listen, he is not this way on accident. I just think he's a really bad person. Yeah. And that doesn't come back in a dementia test. And so now but I think there were a lot of people who, armchair doctors who had convinced themselves. He told, it's almost 365 days, he's told nearly 2,000 lies. And several Pulitzer Prize fact checkers have documented each lie. And some of them are like gross, horrendous lies, and others just seem to be him not understanding the issue. And so people thought, maybe there's something wrong with, like maybe he is like early dementia. It's like, no, he's just a liar. And it's very different. Okay, now, I'm going to try to do like a round robin thing here. Well, I'm going to be very quick, okay? So I'll just work my way around. So I'll start here and work my way around, but I'll come to you. But we only have just about 10 minutes, so I'll move quickly. Amen.
So you mentioned 2 great points about communities in this country that are living in small bubbles and they don't realize it. And you also mentioned how people on the right and the left, they believe they do things the right way.
Yeah.
How do you think young people of color can communicate to people who believe they're doing things on the right way, that they're doing things the wrong way, and what should be the next step?
Let me first, that's a great question. There are about 100 ways, there are 99 ways to get this conversation wrong, and getting it right is like threading a needle. It's a very difficult, it by and large does not work. People who see the world so differently. I've spoken now in 35 states over the past 3 years, hundreds of college campuses. People who see the world so differently. I've been a part of conversations. They don't work well, and they fail almost every time. Here's the only way I've seen it work. It doesn't work well in an open forum like this. It doesn't work well in a forum like we have tonight. It doesn't work well in an accidental place, like at the end of class, the teacher asks a loaded question. These deep emotional conversations are only working well in a small room where the people who are invited to the conversation were chosen very, very carefully based on someone's opinion that these people are active listeners who are willing to think outside of the bubble, and it has a skilled moderator, and everybody who's in that small room of 10 to 12 people knew well in advance what the conversation was going to be about, and there were clear rules and guidelines on what could and could not be said. That's about the only scenario where I've seen it done well. And the flip of that is, I've seen it go horribly wrong in 99 other ways. Even, let me say this, even when people were really well-intentioned. Just, certain things are so deeply felt and believed and emotional that if you don't curate this conversation in a very special way, it likely won't work. And I won't say it's a complete waste of time, but whatever the step above complete waste of time is, it's like right, half a step above complete waste. Because it's good to try, but sometimes trying and doing it wrong can leave things worse.
Yes.
And so we have to be very careful.
Yes.
All right. Let me work my way around here. All right. Here we go. What's your name, man?
Jose.
Yeah, good to see you, Jose.
So several people opposing Kaepernick, including Donald Trump, have referred to him as ungrateful, and that term has also been used to describe immigrants who are fighting for their rights here.
Yeah.
In terms of bubbles, what do you think that says about how people opposing these movements see the movement as?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, man. Language is powerful, and the words we use and the words that catch on often have deep coded meaning, and this word of ungrateful actually has deep history to it. First, it suggests that the people you're calling ungrateful don't work really hard for everything they get, and as if they've been given a reward that they did not earn, and so that's disrespectful. But it also creates this notion that one group thinks this country is theirs and everyone else should be grateful that they are given any place, power, privilege, and that's just not true. This country, I will say this, as I've traveled the world, and for all of you who are students, if you still have time to study abroad, I would really deeply encourage you to do so. It changed. I studied abroad in South Africa when I was a college student, and I've been able to travel abroad. And the United States is one of the most complicated countries in the world, hands down. The more I've seen the rest of the world, there are days where I feel like this country is an experiment gone wrong. And anybody, there's really only one people group who could seriously claim, hey, this country is ours. And indigenous Americans traditionally don't even have that philosophy of the world of ownership. And so even that philosophy was exploited. And so it's a problem. And then I'll close with this. This notion of whose country this is, even this notion that this is a Christian country, it's not. And I don't believe it ever was. It's definitely not a white person's country. But the very definitions of race and ethnicity and all of that, these categories were created primarily for exploitation. And some of our struggle gets to, we're trying to fix complicated problems that really don't have solutions sometimes, because we're dealing with the very concept of race and color and all this stuff is flawed in and of itself. Hey, man.
What's going on, Shaun? My name's Stefan. As a social justice activist, you kind of really are at the forefront of a lot of injustices that happen around our country. And you've been doing this for years. How do you keep that fight going while keeping the fire inside of you still going without it kind of being dimmed and dampened by kind of a lot of what's happening, and just being tired of kind of having to carry that torch? How do you kind of keep that fire going? How do you inspire people to keep that fire going?
Well, just to be completely transparent, I have tremendous ups and downs, and there are definitely times where that light is just a flicker for me, for sure. And I'll tell one story about that later tonight. There have been times where I've been on the edge of even depression myself with all the fights that we've had, and we've seen so few results from those fights. But there are two things that keep me going. One is every day new families who experience injustice reach out to me. And for those, like, we may be tired of police brutality as an issue, or racism as an issue, but some family who just experienced it this morning, it's fresh for them. And I feel in a lot of ways I owe it to those families to be my best self however I can be. But I said it to say that I know that I can't be effective if I don't take care of myself. And so I have boundaries. I have, there are things that I do to take care of myself. I'm not on 24 hours a day. I turn my phone off. I don't watch a lot of news on television. I never watch the news in front of my children. I don't, even when something horrible is going on, I try not to be obsessed with whatever's going on. I try to be balanced. I take vacations when I can. I go out. My wife and I try to go out whenever we can. I said to say that I give myself space to breathe, to reflect, to laugh. I watch comedians. I'm a huge sports fan. I watch sports. I'm a huge NBA fan, so I'm watching, the league this year. Those things allow me to, breathe a little. And one thing that I've come to love, as I've come to know a lot of these athletes, they see a lot of athletes used to wonder, like, man, what is me playing basketball? What does this even mean to the world, But a lot of those guys have come to understand, like, wow, I'm giving guys like you and others, I'm giving people an opportunity to tune out this ugly world for 2 hours. Laugh, cheer, wear paraphernalia or whatever. I'm giving these guys, I'm giving men and women a chance to unplug for a little bit.
So unfortunately, one of the barriers
Yeah.
is time.
Yeah.
And we've exhausted our time. Let me encourage you all to come this evening to the Senior Ballroom at the Cubs, 7 o'clock tonight. Shaun will be talking about social activism. And now join me in thanking him for a really interesting